There is a moment just before the salvage divers descend when the water seems to hold its breath. The Atlantic off Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, runs shallow here, deceptively calm, its surface catching the morning light in patterns that could almost pass for ordinary. Fishing boats drift through these same waters every season, their crews hauling in shrimp and flounder, paying no mind to the sandbars that shift beneath them with each passing storm. For nearly 3 centuries, this stretch of coast kept its secret, buried under 20 feet of water and several more of sand, silt, and the accumulated debris of time itself. The fishermen passed over it, the pleasure boats sailed through it. Hurricane after hurricane reshaped the seafloor, covering and uncovering and covering again what lay beneath, and still no one knew. No one suspected that somewhere in this murky water, resting in scattered pieces across what would eventually measure more than an acre of ocean floor, lay the remains of the most feared pirate ship ever to terrorize the Atlantic coast. The flagship of a man whose very name became synonymous with the golden age of piracy itself, Queen Anne's Revenge, the vessel that carried Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard, through 18 months of maritime terror that would echo through centuries of legend, folklore and imagination. The ship that mounted 40 cannons and struck such fear into merchant captains that many surrendered at the mere sight of her colours rising on the horizon. The floating fortress from which one of history's most theatrical villains conducted his brief, spectacular career of plunder, intimidation, and calculated violence. She went down in June of 1718 in circumstances that remain as murky as the waters that claimed her, and for 278 years she simply vanished. The ocean swallowed her whole, the sand buried her bones, and Blackbeard's most powerful weapon became nothing more than a story, a legend, a name invoked in tavern tales and children's books, but never confirmed, never touched, never truly known. Until 1996, when a team of researchers from a small private salvage company followed a hunch, studied the historical currents, and put divers into the water near a site that local fishermen had long called a snag hazard. What they found on that November morning would eventually yield more than 400,000 individual artefacts, would rewrite portions of what we thought we understood about early 18th century piracy, would reveal medical instruments suggesting practices far more sophisticated than historians had credited to pirate crews, and would force uncomfortable confrontations with the human cargo that vessels like this one carried in the decades before the trade in human beings became the defining moral horror of the Atlantic world. This is the story of that ship, that man, and the ongoing excavation that continues to pull secrets from the seafloor to this very day. But more than that, this is an exploration of what the ocean reveals when it finally decides to let go, of what 3 centuries of silence can teach us about the forgotten, the overlooked, the deliberately obscured, and of the questions that remain even now as archaeologists sift through the fragmentary evidence of a vessel that seems to resist simple explanation at every turn. The man who would become Blackbeard likely entered the world around 1680, though even this most basic biographical fact carries the weight of uncertainty. Birth records for common English sailors of this era survive only sporadically, and Edward Teach, if that was indeed his original name, left no diary, no letters, no personal documentation of any kind. What we know of him comes filtered through the accounts of his enemies, the sensationalized reporting of colonial newspapers, and the often unreliable testimony of captured pirates who may have said whatever they believed their captors wanted to hear. Some historians have suggested his surname was Thatch, or Drummond. Some have placed his birth in Bristol, others in Jamaica, still others in the American colonies themselves. The historical record offers glimpses, fragments, tantalizing hints that never quite resolve into certainty. What does seem clear is that by the early 1700s he had gone to sea, likely serving aboard privateering vessels during Queen Anne's War, the conflict between England and France that ravaged the Caribbean and the American coastline from 1702 to 1713. Privateering in this era occupied a curious legal space, a form of state-sanctioned piracy, in which private ship captains received official letters of marque authorizing them to attack and capture enemy merchant vessels, keeping a portion of the spoils in exchange for weakening the enemy's commercial interests. It was, in essence, legalized robbery, and it trained a generation of sailors in the tactics, the violence, and the psychology of maritime predation. When the war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, thousands of these men found themselves suddenly unemployed, their skills in demand nowhere, their options narrowing to the legitimate merchant trade, with its low pay and brutal discipline, or the outlaw life that so many of them had already been practicing under the protection of official sanction. Teach chose piracy, and in this choice he was far from alone. The years immediately following Queen Anne's War witnessed an explosion of piratical activity throughout the Atlantic world, as former privateers, unemployed naval sailors, and desperate men from a dozen different circumstances converged on the shipping lanes that carried sugar, rum, tobacco, and enslaved human beings between Africa, the Caribbean, and the ports of the American colonies. Historians sometimes call this period the Golden Age of piracy, though the term carries a romantic gloss that obscures the violence, the squalor, and the desperate circumstances that drove men to this life. There was nothing golden about it for the merchants who lost their cargoes, for the sailors who were pressed into pirate service against their will, or for the countless human beings whose bondage and suffering formed the economic foundation on which all this maritime commerce rested. By 1716, Teach had fallen in with a pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold, operating out of the lawless haven of Nassau in the Bahamas. Under Hornigold's command, he learned the trade, honed his skills, and began to cultivate the theatrical persona that would eventually make him famous. The historical record offers only scattered references to these early years, but by 1717 something had changed. Teach had acquired his own vessel, a sloop, and had begun operating independently, though still in loose confederation with Hornigold's flotilla. And then, in late November of that year, came the prize that would transform him from one pirate among many into the most feared name in the Atlantic. The vessel was French, a 300-ton slave ship called La Concorde, and Teach captured her somewhere near the island of Martinique. She was carrying a cargo of enslaved Africans bound for the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and her hold contained not only human beings but also gold dust, jewellery, and trade goods accumulated during her voyage along the West African coast. What happened to her human cargo after the capture remains one of the many uncertainties that shadow this history. Some were likely kept aboard as forced labourers. Others may have been sold into slavery through the pirates' own illicit trading networks. The historical record offers no clear answer, only the knowledge that these individuals existed, that they suffered, and that their fates were determined by circumstances utterly beyond their control. Teach kept the ship. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a title that some historians interpret as a reference to the recently ended war, others as an ironic political statement, and still others as simply a name chosen for its intimidating grandeur. Whatever his reasoning, he set about transforming her into the most formidable pirate vessel in the Atlantic. Additional cannons were mounted, bringing her total armament to approximately 40 guns. Her rigging was modified for speed and manoeuvrability. Her crew swelled to several hundred men, drawn from captured vessels from the port of Nassau and from the desperate margins of colonial society. The ship that emerged from this transformation was not merely a tool of piracy. She was a statement, a floating declaration of power, a weapon as much psychological as physical. Merchant captains who spotted her on the horizon knew exactly what they faced. The black flag rising on her mainmast, the rows of cannon bristling from her gun ports, the reputation that preceded her wherever she sailed. Many surrendered without a fight, calculating that their lives were worth more than whatever cargo their employers had entrusted to them. And Teach Theatrical always cultivated this reputation with calculated precision, binding slow-burning fuses into his great black beard during battle so that his face would appear wreathed in smoke and flame, dressing in long coats festooned with pistols and cutlasses, crafting an image of demonic menace that served his purposes far more effectively than actual violence ever could. Yet violence there was. The historical record contains accounts of torture, of mutilation, of punishments designed to terrorize captured crews into cooperation. How much of this actually occurred, and how much was embellished by colonial newspapers, hungry for lurid copy, remains difficult to determine. What does seem clear is that Teach understood the economics of fear, that a reputation for cruelty reduced the need for actual fighting, that the more terrifying he appeared, the fewer men he would have to kill. It was a calculation as cold as it was effective, and for 18 months it worked brilliantly. From late 1717 through the spring of 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge and her accompanying flotilla, which at times included several smaller vessels operating in concert, terrorised the coastline from the Caribbean to the Carolinas. Ships were captured, plundered, and either incorporated into the pirate fleet or stripped and released. Entire towns lived in fear of Blackbeard's appearance in their harbours. Colonial governments proved largely powerless to stop him. Their naval resources stretched thin, their coordination with neighbouring colonies minimal, their understanding of his movements always several steps behind reality. The climax came in May of 1718, when Teach and his fleet appeared in the waters off Charlestown, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest and most important ports in British North America. For nearly a week the pirates blockaded the harbour, capturing every vessel that attempted to enter or leave, holding prominent citizens for ransom, and demanding, in a twist that has puzzled historians ever since, not gold or silver or valuables, but a chest of medical supplies. The exact contents of this chest remain a matter of debate. Some historians have suggested the pirates were suffering from syphilis and needed mercury treatments. Others have proposed various tropical diseases. Still others have noted that medical supplies would have been valuable trade goods in their own right. Whatever the reason, the colonial government eventually complied. The hostages were released, and Blackbeard's fleet sailed away, having demonstrated to the entire Atlantic world that even the mightiest colonial ports were vulnerable to their depredations. And then, barely a month later, Queen Anne's Revenge was gone. The circumstances of her loss have never been fully explained, and it is here that the archaeological evidence takes on particular significance. According to the surviving historical accounts, primarily drawn from the later testimony of captured pirates, the great ship ran aground on a sandbar near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, in early June of 1718. A smaller sloop, the Adventure, attempting to assist, ran aground as well. Both vessels were eventually lost, though Teach himself and a portion of his crew escaped aboard a smaller vessel and made their way to the town of Bath, where the pirate captain had somehow obtained a pardon from the colonial governor. The question that has haunted historians ever since is whether this grounding was truly an accident. The timing seems almost too convenient. In the weeks before the loss, Blackbeard had announced his intention to accept a royal pardon and retire from piracy. Many of his crew were sceptical, unwilling to trust promises from governments that hanged pirates whenever they could catch them. By running aground, Teach effectively stranded the majority of his large crew, leaving them on a narrow strip of barrier island with little food and no means of escape, while he and a carefully selected handful of loyal men escaped with whatever gold and valuables they could carry. Was it miscalculation, a navigational error in unfamiliar waters? Was it deliberate sabotage, a ruthless scheme to shed unwanted crew members and escape with the concentrated wealth of months of piracy? Or was it something else entirely, some circumstance the historical record has simply failed to preserve? The wreck could not answer these questions when it was first discovered in 1996, but as the excavation has progressed, as artefact after artefact has been pulled from the sediment and analysed with techniques that would have seemed like sorcery to Teach himself, certain patterns have begun to emerge, certain details that complicate the simple narratives we have inherited. The discovery itself was almost anticlimactic. Intersal, Inc., a small private salvage company based in Florida, had been researching potential wreck sites in the Beaufort area for years, drawing on historical documents, hydrographic surveys, and the accumulated knowledge of local fishing communities. The waters off the North Carolina coast are treacherous, studded with sandbars that shift with storms and currents, littered with the remains of countless vessels that met their ends on what sailors once called the graveyard of the Atlantic. Finding one specific wreck among so many seemed nearly impossible. Yet on November 21st, 1996, a diver named Mike Daniel descended through murky green water to examine yet another anomaly on the ocean floor, and found himself face to face with a cannon. Not just any cannon, a cannon from the early 18th century, encrusted with centuries of marine growth, half buried in sand but unmistakably there. And then another, and another. The site eventually yielded over 20 cannons, a number consistent with historical accounts of Queen Anne's Revenge, though somewhat lower than the 40 guns she reportedly mounted in her prime. The discrepancy has never been fully explained. Were some cannons removed before the final grounding? Did the wreck break apart and scatter in ways that left portions still undiscovered? Has sediment simply buried evidence that future excavations may yet uncover? These questions matter because they speak to the larger mystery of what actually happened in those final days. A ship preparing for deliberate abandonment might have had some of her valuable armament removed in advance. A ship caught by surprise on a sandbar would presumably have gone down with everything aboard. The archaeological evidence, fragmentary and incomplete, offers tantalising hints but no definitive answers. What it does offer is detail, extraordinary, intimate detail about the lives of the men who sailed aboard this vessel. The artefacts recovered over the past quarter century tell stories that no written record could ever capture. Consider the medical instruments, for example. Among the items pulled from the seafloor are brass syringes, pewter urethral syringes specifically designed for treating venereal disease, fragments of surgical implements, and the scattered remains of a medicine chest that may well be connected to the mysterious medical supplies demanded during the Charlestown blockade. These objects speak to a level of medical awareness that historians have sometimes been reluctant to attribute to pirate crews, suggesting that Teach either employed or conscripted someone with genuine medical knowledge, that health concerns aboard his vessel were taken seriously, that the stereotypical image of filthy, disease-ridden pirates may not capture the full complexity of how these floating communities actually functioned. Or consider the lead shot found scattered across the site. Thousands of pieces in various calibers, some still bearing the marks of the moulds in which they were cast. Among these are fragments of African gold weights, decorative brass objects originally used in the gold trade along the West African coast, which had been melted down and recast as ammunition. Here, in a handful of misshapen lead pellets, lies evidence of the intersection between piracy and the transatlantic slave trade. The recycling of objects that had once facilitated the sale of human beings into weapons that would perpetuate the cycle of violence in which that trade was embedded. The pirates who fired these shots may not have reflected on the history embedded in their ammunition, but the archaeologists who now study these objects cannot help but recognise what they represent: the layers of exploitation, violence and human suffering compressed into a few ounces of lead. The wreck site itself covers a surprisingly large area, evidence of how violently the vessel broke apart as she was pounded by waves and currents over the years and decades following her loss. The main concentration of artefacts lies in approximately 20 feet of water, but debris has been found scattered across a much wider area, and researchers believe significant portions of the ship may still remain buried beneath sediment that has accumulated over 3 centuries. The excavation is ongoing, painstakingly slow, conducted primarily during summer months when weather conditions permit, and new discoveries continue to emerge with each passing season. Among the most striking finds are the anchors. A large bower anchor, weighing approximately 2,000 pounds, was recovered in 2011, one of the most massive objects ever raised from the site. Its size speaks to the scale of the vessel itself, the engineering required to hold a 300-ton warship in place against the pull of currents and tides. Smaller anchors have been found as well, along with anchor-related hardware, the mechanical infrastructure that would have been essential to a ship that spent its existence manoeuvring through shallow coastal waters, dropping anchor to ambush passing merchant vessels, weighing anchor to flee when circumstances demanded. The anchors also raise questions about the final moments. Why were they not deployed in a last desperate attempt to pull the ship free of the sandbar? Were conditions so sudden, so chaotic, that there was no time? Or did Teach, if the grounding was indeed deliberate, want to ensure that there would be no possibility of refloating the vessel once he had stripped her of what he wanted? Gold has been found, not in vast quantities, but enough to confirm that the site is indeed associated with a successful pirate operation. Gold dust, loose grains that had spilled from whatever containers originally held them, has been recovered from the sediment. Fragments of gold leaf, possibly from decorative objects or the gilt work that adorned wealthy vessels of the period, have turned up as well. These finds are tantalising precisely because of what they imply about what has not yet been recovered. If gold dust spilled loose across the wreck site, what happened to the containers, the chests, the stored wealth that a ship like Queen Anne's Revenge would presumably have accumulated over 18 months of successful piracy? Did Teach take it with him during his escape? Does it lie buried still, beneath sand that has not yet been excavated? Or did the ocean scatter it so widely that it may never be found? Personal items offer perhaps the most poignant glimpses into the lives of the crew. Pewter plates and bowls speak to the communal meals taken aboard ship. Fragments of glass suggest bottles of wine or rum. the liquid currency that lubricated social life in the 18th century Atlantic. Coins from multiple nations, English, Spanish, Portuguese, reflect the international character of both piracy and the maritime economy it preyed upon. Belt buckles, buttons, fragments of leather, the small, ordinary objects that men carry through their daily lives, all these have emerged from the site, reminding us that beneath the legend, beneath the theatrical menace of Blackbeard himself, were ordinary human beings whose individual stories have been almost entirely lost. The recovery of slave trade artefacts deserves particular attention, for they force us to confront aspects of this history that romantic narratives of piracy have often preferred to ignore. Queen Anne's Revenge began her existence as a slave ship, and many of the objects recovered from her reflect this original purpose. Shackles have been found on the site, the iron restraints used to immobilize human beings during the horrific Middle Passage. Glass beads, the trade goods exchanged for human beings along the African coast, lie scattered among the debris. These objects are not incidental to the story of Blackbeard's flagship. They are central to it, material evidence of the system of human exploitation that formed the economic foundation of the entire Atlantic world in which Teach operated. The pirates who crewed Queen Anne's Revenge were not liberators. While some popular accounts have tried to cast pirates as proto-revolutionaries, rebels against an oppressive colonial order, the reality was far more complicated. Pirate vessels certainly offered certain freedoms that naval and merchant ships did not, including more democratic forms of governance and more equitable distribution of plunder. But pirates also participated in the slave trade, both directly and indirectly, and the wealth they sought to capture often included human beings whose bondage they had no intention of challenging. The artefacts from the wreck site will not let us forget this, will not permit the comfortable simplification of a story that is ultimately about violence, exploitation, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. The wreck lies in state waters, subject to the jurisdiction of North Carolina, and from the beginning, the decision was made to treat the site as an archaeological resource rather than a commercial salvage opportunity. Intersal Inc., the company that made the discovery, initially hoped to retain a portion of the artefacts, but legal battles eventually resulted in the state taking full control of the excavation and conservation process. The Queen Anne's Revenge project, as the ongoing effort is now known, operates under the auspices of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, with artefacts conserved and displayed at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort, just a few miles from where the ship went down more than 300 years ago. Conservation of artefacts recovered from saltwater is itself a painstaking years-long process. Iron objects must be carefully desalinated over extended periods, sometimes requiring years of treatment before they are stable enough for display. Organic materials, wood, leather, textiles pose particular challenges as they begin to deteriorate the moment they are removed from the oxygen-poor environment of the seafloor. Many of the artefacts from Queen Anne's Revenge remain in conservation even now, their full stories still waiting to be told, their secrets still being coaxed from the chemical processes that have transformed them over 3 centuries of submersion. And what of Blackbeard himself? His story did not end with the loss of his flagship. After the grounding, he made his way to the colonial town of Bath, where he received a pardon from Governor Charles Eden, a transaction that has raised suspicions of corruption ever since. For several months he appears to have lived in something resembling respectability, even marrying a local woman, his 14th wife by some accounts, though how many of these marriages were genuine and how many were simply taken women from captured vessels remains unclear. But the respite was brief. By autumn of 1718, reports suggested that Teach had returned to piracy, and the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, determined to end the threat once and for all. In November of 1718, just 5 months after the loss of Queen Anne's Revenge, 2 sloops under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy cornered Blackbeard and a small remnant of his crew at Ocracoke Inlet, along the North Carolina coast. The battle that followed has become the stuff of legend, the wounded pirate captain fighting on even as blood poured from multiple wounds, the hand-to-hand combat on the deck of Maynard's sloop, the final moments when Teach was finally brought down by a combination of gunshot and cutlass blows. According to later accounts, his body bore 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 sword cuts when he finally fell. Maynard had the pirate's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his vessel as he sailed back to Virginia, a grim trophy that would later adorn a pole at the entrance to Hampton Roads, a warning to any who might be tempted to follow in Blackbeard's wake. The location of his body, cast into the waters of Pamlico Sound according to tradition, has never been determined. There is no grave to visit, no final resting place, only the stories that have accumulated over 3 centuries and the physical remains of the ship that carried him through his most powerful months. In a sense, Queen Anne's Revenge has become his tomb, the closest thing to a material monument that this most theatrical of pirates will ever have. Yet the wreck continues to pose questions that archaeology alone may never answer. The site has yielded fragments of what appear to be multiple vessels, raising the possibility that debris from other ships has become intermixed with the remains of the Flagship. The scatter pattern of artefacts suggests violent disintegration over time, but also possible salvage in the immediate aftermath of the grounding, and possibly subsequent salvage attempts over the centuries before official excavation began. Local traditions hold that the wreck was known to fishermen long before 1996, that divers had visited the site informally, that objects had been quietly removed over the years. How much of the original assemblage remains, and how much has been lost to these unrecorded episodes of disturbance, can only be guessed. The ship's bell, traditionally one of the most prized artefacts from any wreck recovery, has never been found. Was it salvaged before the official excavation began? Does it lie buried still, waiting beneath sand that shifting currents may one day expose? Or was it lost entirely, perhaps removed by Blackbeard himself as he abandoned his flagship, a trophy of his command that he may have carried to his own death just months later? The questions multiply the deeper one looks. Consider the cannons. Those recovered from the site represent a mix of origins, Swedish, English, and other national manufactures, reflecting the haphazard way that pirate vessels accumulated their armament from captured prizes. But the distribution of these weapons across the wreck site raises questions about how they were arranged aboard the living ship. Were they mounted in a standard broadside configuration? Were some kept as spares, stored in the hold rather than ready for action? The archaeological evidence suggests a more complex picture than the simple 40-gun warship of legend. A vessel that may have been armed differently at different times, adapting its firepower to changing circumstances and available resources. And then there are the human remains, or rather, their absence. Despite the extensive excavation of the site, no human bones have been definitively recovered from Queen Anne's Revenge. This is itself significant, though the interpretation remains uncertain. Perhaps the crew escaped before the ship broke apart. Perhaps bodies were recovered for burial in the immediate aftermath. Perhaps the natural processes of marine decomposition, the action of scavengers and bacteria in warm coastal waters, erased all trace of the dead over 3 centuries. Or perhaps the answers lie in portions of the site that have not yet been excavated, pockets of sediment where evidence still waits. The investigation continues. Each summer, divers return to the waters off Beaufort Inlet. Each season brings new artefacts, new data, new questions. The story of Queen Anne's Revenge is not yet complete. Not the story of how she came to rest on this sandy bottom. Not the story of what she reveals about early 18th century piracy. Not the story of the men who lived and died aboard her decks. The ocean has begun to surrender its secrets, but slowly, reluctantly, in fragments and pieces that must be assembled like a puzzle, for which we do not possess all the parts. What does it mean to stand in the conservation laboratory of the North Carolina Maritime Museum, to look at a cannon that once roared defiance at merchant vessels throughout the Atlantic, to hold in one's hands the medical instruments that treated wounds and diseases aboard a pirate flagship? The objects themselves are mute. They cannot tell us what Blackbeard's voice sounded like, whether his famous cruelty was calculated performance or genuine sadism, what he thought during those final moments as his ship ground to a halt on the sandbar, and his career as the terror of the seas effectively came to an end. They can only testify to what they are, material evidence of a vanished world, fragments of a past that refuses to resolve into simple narrative. Yet perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is precisely what makes this ongoing excavation so valuable, the way it resists the easy stories we have told ourselves about pirates and piracy, the way it insists on complexity, on uncertainty, on the irreducible strangeness of the past. Blackbeard as legend is a figure of romantic rebellion or demonic villainy, depending on who is doing the telling. Blackbeard as revealed by the archaeology of his flagship is something more elusive, a figure embedded in networks of violence, trade, exploitation, and survival that extended across 3 continents and involved the fates of countless individuals whose names we will never know. The shackles speak to this. The melted down gold weights recast as ammunition speak to this. The medical instruments speak to this. Taken together, they offer not a portrait of a single legendary pirate, but a window into an entire world, the brutal, fascinating, morally complex world of the early 18th century Atlantic, a world that we have inherited whether we acknowledge it or not, whose legacies continue to shape us in ways we are only beginning to understand. And the excavation continues. Somewhere beneath the sand and water of Beaufort Inlet more answers wait. More questions wait as well. The ship has begun to tell her story, but she's not finished telling it. Not yet. Perhaps not for decades to come. What else lies buried there, waiting for the patient work of divers and archaeologists to bring it back into the light? What other fragments of this vanished world will the ocean finally consent to release? These are questions that the next seasons of excavation may begin to answer. But before we can fully appreciate what's being found, we must first understand more clearly the world from which this vessel emerged. The chaotic, violent, strangely egalitarian society of pirates that flourished so briefly in the years following Queen Anne's War, and the historical circumstances that led an ordinary sailor named Edward Teach to become the most feared man in the Atlantic. The transformation of Edward Teach into Blackbeard did not occur overnight. It was a process shaped by the peculiar economic and political conditions of the early 18th century Atlantic, a world in which the lines between legitimate privateering and outright piracy blurred so thoroughly that men could slide from one category to the other almost without noticing the transition. To understand how an unknown sailor became history's most notorious pirate, one must first understand the war that created him, the opportunities it opened, and the crisis that followed its conclusion. Queen Anne's War, known in Europe as the War of the Spanish Succession, raged from 1702 until 1713. Like most European conflicts of the period, it spilled inevitably across the Atlantic, entangling the colonies of Britain, France and Spain in a struggle that disrupted trade, devastated coastal communities, and created an enormous demand for armed vessels willing to attack enemy shipping. The governments of these nations, lacking the naval resources to patrol every sea lane and protect every colonial interest, turned to privateers, privately owned ships granted official commissions to prey upon enemy commerce. A privateer's letter of marque transformed what would otherwise be piracy into a legal and even honourable occupation. The captain and crew who seized an enemy merchant vessel were not criminals but patriots, entitled to a share of the captured goods and the respect of their countrymen. Thousands of men learned their trade during these years. They learned how to handle a ship in combat, how to board an enemy vessel, how to intimidate a crew into surrender without the costly business of actual fighting. They learned the sea lanes of the Atlantic and the Caribbean, which ports offered safe harbour, which officials could be bribed, which stretches of coast provided ideal ambush points. They learned, in short, all the skills that would serve them equally well as pirates once the war ended, and end it did. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht brought peace to Europe and immediate economic catastrophe to the men who had spent a decade fighting at sea. Privateer commissions were revoked. Thousands of experienced sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed, cast adrift in colonial ports with no prospects and no income. The merchant fleets that might have absorbed them had been decimated by the very war these men had been fighting. There was, quite simply, no legitimate work to be found. The result was predictable. The same skills that had made these men valuable privateers made them equally capable pirates. The same ships that had served as licensed commerce raiders needed only to tear up their letters of marque to become outlaw vessels. Within months of the war's end, the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of the American colonies saw an explosion of piracy unprecedented in scope and scale. Historians estimate that at the height of what is now called the Golden Age of piracy, between 1716 and 1718, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates operated in Atlantic waters, a number that seems small until one considers that they were preying upon a maritime economy already weakened by years of war. These were not desperate men driven to occasional theft. They were organised, experienced, and terrifyingly effective. They were, in the most literal sense, the war's veterans, and they brought military discipline and tactics to their new profession. It was into this world that Edward Teach emerged, though exactly when and how remains frustratingly unclear. The fragmentary historical record suggests he was born in Bristol, England, sometime around 1680, though some accounts place his birth in Jamaica or other colonial ports. He seems to have served aboard privateering vessels during Queen Anne's War, perhaps in the Caribbean, perhaps along the American coast. By 1716, he appears in the historical record as a member of the crew serving under Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most successful pirates of the era, operating out of the lawless haven of New Providence in the Bahamas. Here, in a town that had become effectively a pirate republic, Teach completed his education in the arts of maritime predation. Hornigold recognised talent when he saw it. Sometime in 1717, he gave Teach command of a captured sloop, a smaller vessel that could operate in consort with Hornigold's flagship. The partnership proved enormously successful. Together, they captured numerous prizes throughout the Caribbean and along the coast of North America. But Teach was ambitious. He was learning not only how to capture ships, but how to inspire terror, how to cultivate a reputation that would make resistance seem futile and surrender seem wise. The transformation came in November of 1717. Near the island of Martinique, the Hornigold-Teach partnership captured a French merchant vessel named La Concorde. She was a substantial ship, 300 tons burthen, recently arrived from the Guinea coast of Africa, with a cargo of enslaved people destined for sale in the Caribbean. Teach saw immediately what she could become. With Hornigold's blessing, or perhaps without it, Teach took command of La Concorde, renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, and began the process of converting her into a pirate flagship of unprecedented power. He increased her armament to as many as 40 guns, recruited a crew that would eventually number 300 men, and set about establishing himself as a pirate captain in his own right. The name he chose for his vessel is itself revealing. Queen Anne's Revenge. A revenge for what? The war that had created him and then abandoned him. The legitimate maritime career denied him by the peace. The social order that offered men like him nothing but exploitation and contempt. The name suggests grievance, resentment, a sense of scores to be settled. Whatever the personal meaning, the choice linked Teach's piratical career explicitly to the war that had shaped it, a reminder that piracy in these years was not simply criminality, but a kind of continuation of war by other means. And then came the persona. Edward Teach understood something about violence that many of his contemporaries did not. The truth that reputation could be more powerful than actual force, that the appearance of overwhelming menace could accomplish what actual fighting could not. The image he created for himself was carefully calculated, each element designed to inspire maximum terror in those who encountered him. He grew his famous beard, that mass of black hair that covered almost his entire face and extended down to his chest. Before battle, according to contemporary accounts, he would braid this beard into multiple tails, each wrapped with ribbons, and tuck slow-burning fuses into the braids so that smoke curled around his face like some demon emerging from the pit. He wore a sling across his shoulders that held 6 pistols, all loaded and ready, and he draped himself in additional weapons, cutlasses and daggers, creating the image of a man who was less a human being than a walking arsenal. His eyes, witnesses reported, seemed to glow with an unnatural fire. His voice was a thunderous roar. How much of this was genuine and how much performance? The question may be unanswerable, and perhaps it misses the point. The persona was effective. That was what mattered. Ships surrendered to Blackbeard without a fight. Entire communities trembled at rumours of his approach. The man had become the myth, had deliberately transformed himself into something more than human, a figure of nightmare whose very appearance seemed to promise violence beyond imagining. And yet the historical record suggests that Blackbeard was, by the standards of his profession, remarkably restrained in his use of actual violence. He captured numerous vessels throughout his career. He terrorized coastal communities from the Caribbean to the Carolinas, but documented instances of him actually killing captives or inflicting serious harm on those who surrendered are remarkably rare. The terror was the point. The violence was the threat. The persona accomplished what actual brutality could not: complete psychological domination of anyone who encountered him. Was this calculation or temperament? Was Blackbeard a clever businessman who understood that dead captives and burned ships produced no profit? Or was there something else at work? Some residual sense of honour or restraint beneath the demonic exterior? The artefacts from Queen Anne's Revenge cannot tell us. They can only testify to the material reality of his operation, the cannons that gave substance to his threats, the medical instruments that suggest some concern for the welfare of his crew, the shackles that remind us of the human suffering that underpinned the entire Atlantic economy in which he operated. By the spring of 1718, Blackbeard had established himself as the most feared pirate in American waters. Queen Anne's Revenge, with her 40 guns and her enormous crew, was the most powerful pirate vessel operating in the Atlantic. In late May, Blackbeard put this power to dramatic use. He led a small fleet into the harbour of Charlestown, South Carolina, the 5th largest city in British North America, a major port whose wealth depended entirely on maritime commerce. For nearly a week, Blackbeard blockaded the city. He captured multiple vessels attempting to enter or leave the harbour. He held their passengers hostage, including several prominent citizens. His demand was remarkably specific: a chest of medicine. Charlestown, terrified, complied. The medicine was delivered. The hostages were released. Blackbeard sailed away, having demonstrated that he could operate with impunity against even the largest colonial cities, that no harbour was safe, that the power of the British Empire meant nothing when confronted with 40 cannons and a man whose face emerged wreathed in smoke. What was in that medicine chest? Why did Blackbeard, at the height of his power, demand drugs rather than gold or goods? The question has puzzled historians for 3 centuries. The most common theory points to mercury, the standard treatment at the time for syphilis, suggesting that Blackbeard or members of his crew were suffering from venereal disease. The medical instruments recovered from Queen Anne's Revenge lend weight to this interpretation. Some of them are specifically designed for the treatment of urethral complaints, the kind of specialised equipment that would be carried by a surgeon expected to deal with sexually transmitted infections among a large crew. But other possibilities exist. The chest may have contained treatments for scurvy, for tropical fevers, for the countless ailments that plagued men who spent their lives in cramped, unsanitary conditions on the open sea. We cannot know for certain. The chest itself is lost to history. Only the demand remains. A strange footnote to the most audacious action of Blackbeard's career, the successful pirate blockade of a major colonial city. Yet even as Blackbeard achieved this triumph, the end was approaching. Scarcely 2 weeks after the Charlestown blockade, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on the sandbar near Beaufort Inlet, and Blackbeard's career as master of a powerful flagship came to an abrupt end. The circumstances of this grounding, as we have already discussed, remain mysterious. What came after is better documented, though no less strange. Blackbeard, now commanding only a smaller sloop, his great ship abandoned to the sea, sailed into the recently established town of Bath in North Carolina, and presented himself to Governor Charles Eden. He claimed he wished to retire from piracy. He accepted a pardon under the terms of a royal proclamation, offering amnesty to pirates who surrendered themselves before a specified date. He was legally speaking a reformed man. Governor Eden accepted this story. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he had other reasons for welcoming a notorious pirate into his colony, reasons that subsequent events would make abundantly clear. Blackbeard settled near Bath. He acquired property. He married a local woman, reportedly his 14th wife, though how many of the previous 13 were genuine marriages, and how many were informal arrangements, is unclear. He seemed, to outward appearances, to have become a respectable citizen. But the retirement did not last. Within months, Blackbeard was back at sea, capturing vessels, accumulating plunder, apparently using his alliance with Governor Eden to dispose of stolen goods through corrupt colonial officials. The pardon had been a strategy, not a conversion. The pirate remained a pirate, simply one who now operated under a thin veneer of official sanction. This situation could not continue indefinitely. The merchants and planters of Virginia, their trade disrupted by Blackbeard's continued depredations, grew increasingly furious. They appealed to their own governor, Alexander Spotswood, demanding action. Spotswood, unlike Eden, had no interest in accommodating pirates. He organised an expedition to eliminate Blackbeard permanently, hiring 2 Royal Navy sloops under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard and dispatching them secretly to North Carolina waters. On November 22, 1718, Maynard found Blackbeard at anchor in Ocracoke Inlet, a shallow channel in the Outer Banks where the pirate had established a temporary base. What followed became one of the most famous naval engagements in American history. Blackbeard's sloop, the Adventure, carried only a fraction of the crew and firepower that Queen Anne's Revenge had once commanded. Still, when Maynard's vessels approached, Blackbeard greeted them with characteristic defiance. According to witnesses, he shouted across the water, demanding to know who they were and what they wanted. Maynard replied that they were sent to arrest him. Blackbeard's response reportedly included a toast to the lieutenant's health and a promise that he would give no quarter. The pirates then opened fire with their cannon, killing or wounding a significant number of Maynard's men. But Maynard was clever. He ordered the surviving sailors below deck, creating the impression that his ship had been disabled. When Blackbeard led his remaining crew aboard to take the apparently crippled vessel, Maynard's men emerged from hiding, and the battle became a furious hand-to-hand melee on the deck. Blackbeard and Maynard reportedly fought face to face. Blackbeard received multiple gunshot wounds and continued fighting. He swung his cutlass with such force that he broke Maynard's sword. Only the intervention of one of Maynard's men, slashing at Blackbeard's throat from behind, finally brought the pirate down. When the fighting ended, the most feared man in the Atlantic lay dead on the deck, his body bearing 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 cuts from swords and knives. It had taken extraordinary violence to kill him, violence that seemed to confirm every legend about his superhuman nature. Maynard ordered the body decapitated, and the head hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as proof of the deed accomplished. The headless corpse was thrown overboard. Legend, impossible to verify, claims it swam 3 times around the ship before sinking. The head was eventually displayed on a pole at the entrance to Hampton Roads in Virginia, a warning to other pirates, a trophy of the British Empire's victory over the lawlessness that had terrorised its colonies. The survivors of Blackbeard's crew were captured and tried. Most were hanged. A few were pardoned, including one Samuel Odell, who claimed to have been a legitimate trader forced into piracy against his will. The Adventure was confiscated. The pirates' property in Bath was seized. Governor Eden, implicated in Blackbeard's activities by documents found aboard the Adventure, escaped formal prosecution, but saw his reputation destroyed. Within a few years, the golden age of piracy was effectively over. The Royal Navy increased its presence in American waters. Colonial governments cracked down on the corrupt officials who had enabled piracy to flourish. The pirates themselves, hunted relentlessly, were killed, captured, or scattered. A chapter of Atlantic history had come to a close, but Queen Anne's revenge remained where she had fallen, resting on the sandy bottom off Beaufort Inlet, forgotten by all except those who had known her, waiting through centuries of storms and tides and gradual burial for the day when someone would come looking for her again. That day came nearly 3 centuries later, and when it did, the artefacts that emerged from the water would begin to tell a story that no written account could fully capture, a story inscribed in corroded metal and fragile organic remains, in the physical traces of lives lived on the margins of history, in the material evidence of a world we thought we understood but which still holds mysteries we have scarcely begun to explore. Consider the challenges facing the archaeologists who work these waters today. The site lies in shallow water subject to powerful currents, storm surges, and the periodic fury of hurricanes that sweep up the Atlantic coast. The visibility underwater is often poor, reduced by suspended sediment to mere inches in some conditions. The wreck itself is not a coherent structure but a scattered debris field. Artifacts distributed over an area of thousands of square feet, some buried beneath layers of sand, others exposed to the corrosive effects of salt water, all fragile beyond imagining after 300 years of submersion. Standard archaeological techniques developed for terrestrial sites where conditions can be controlled and time can be taken must be radically adapted for an environment where divers can work only limited periods before exhaustion or decompression concerns force them to surface, where weather can shut down operations for days or weeks at a time, where every artifact removed must immediately begin an intensive conservation process to prevent its disintegration. The North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, which oversees the excavation, has approached this challenge with remarkable patience. Rather than rushing to recover as much as possible, the archaeological team has proceeded methodically, documenting every artifact in place before removal, creating detailed maps of the debris field, recording the relationships between objects that might reveal information about the ship's construction, its cargo, the arrangement of life aboard. This deliberate pace has frustrated those eager for dramatic discoveries, for the revelation of pirate treasure or definitive answers to historical questions. But it has produced something more valuable, a comprehensive archaeological record that will allow future researchers to revisit the site virtually, to ask questions that current investigators might not have thought to pose, to extract meaning from patterns that only become visible when the entire dataset can be examined as a whole. What patterns are beginning to emerge? The distribution of artifacts across the site has revealed much about the ship's final moments and subsequent deterioration. Heavier objects, the cannons and anchors, tend to remain where they fell, while lighter materials have been scattered by currents and storms. The concentration of certain artifact types in particular areas suggests the original layout of the ship, where the galley was located, where weapons were stored, where the crew slept. Analysis of the wood fragments has provided information about the ship's construction, confirming that she was indeed a French-built vessel consistent with the historical records of La Concorde. Dendrochronological studies, examining the growth rings of the timber, have even allowed researchers to date the wood and identify the regions of France where the trees were harvested. The ship speaks through her bones, revealing her origins even as her identity comes into clearer focus. But perhaps the most revealing artifacts are the small ones, the objects that escaped notice in the early years of excavation when larger, more dramatic finds commanded attention. Tiny fragments of gold leaf, possibly from gilded decorations that once adorned the ship's stern. Beads of glass and semi-precious stone, trade goods that speak to the complex commerce of the early 18th century Atlantic. Lead shot of various calibers, from musket balls to grape shot, revealing the range of weaponry carried aboard. Fish bones and seeds, remnants of meals consumed by crew members whose names will never be known. Each of these objects is a thread in a tapestry of daily life, a glimpse into the routine existence of men whose lives history remembers only through the dramatic moments of capture, violence, and death. Who were these men? What brought them to piracy? What did they hope for? What did they fear? The skeletal remains, few as they are, offer some clues. Isotopic analysis of bone fragments can reveal geographical origins, identifying whether an individual grew up in Europe, Africa, or the Americas based on the chemical signatures left by diet and environment during childhood. Pathological analysis can identify injuries and diseases, the physical toll of lives spent in hard labour and frequent violence. One fragment shows evidence of healed fractures, suggesting a man who survived injuries that might have killed others. Another shows signs of nutritional deficiency, the markers of poverty or deprivation during developmental years. These were not aristocrats who chose adventure over comfort. These were men from the margins, drawn to piracy by desperation or ambition or both, men whose lives had prepared them for the brutal conditions of life at sea, and who saw in Blackbeard's crew an opportunity that legitimate society denied them. The season of excavation draws to a close each fall, and the archaeologists surface for the final time until spring. The site settles back into the rhythms of ocean and sand, the eternal patience of waters that have held these secrets for 3 centuries and will hold them as long as necessary. When the divers return, what will they find? What new fragments of evidence will the currents have exposed or buried anew? What mysteries will begin to resolve, and what new questions will emerge to take their place? The work continues because the ship has not finished yielding her testimony. Somewhere in that scattered debris field, objects still wait, objects that may transform our understanding of early 18th century piracy, of the slave trade, of the lives lived aboard this infamous vessel. The ocean releases its secrets slowly, as if reluctant to part with what it has guarded so long, and the archaeologists return, year after year, patient as the sea itself, knowing that some answers come only with time. And time, on the seafloor, moves according to its own calendar. What seems static to those who observe from above reveals itself, upon closer inspection, to be a realm of constant subtle transformation. Sand shifts grain by grain. Currents redistribute the lightest sediments while heavier deposits compact and settle. Marine organisms colonize exposed surfaces, building their calcium carbonate structures upon the iron and wood of human manufacture, creating hybrid forms that blur the boundary between artifact and reef. The Queen Anne's Revenge has become, in the decades since her rediscovery, something more than a shipwreck. She has become an ecosystem, a foundation for life that has no knowledge of cannons or captains or the particular violence that brought this ship to rest upon this bottom. The The divers who descend to work the site each season observe these changes with the practiced eye of scientists who understand that preservation and deterioration exist in delicate balance. The very conditions that have protected certain artefacts, the anaerobic environment created by burial in sediment, the cold darkness that slows chemical reactions, are disturbed by the act of excavation itself. Each layer removed exposes materials to oxygen, to light, to the biological activity of organisms that had been excluded. The archaeologists race against a clock that they themselves have started, documenting and recovering objects before the new conditions can destroy what centuries of burial preserved. It is a paradox inherent to all underwater archaeology, that discovery is also disturbance, that knowledge comes at a cost to the very evidence that makes knowledge possible. This awareness shapes every decision made on the seafloor. The process of artifact recovery follows protocols designed to minimize damage while maximizing information. Before any object is lifted, its precise location is recorded using a three-dimensional grid system that transforms the chaotic scatter of the debris field into a map of spatial relationships. The position of each artifact relative to every other artifact tells a story that would be lost if objects were simply collected without regard to context. A cannonball found near the bow means something different than the same cannonball found near the stern. A collection of personal items clustered together may indicate a crew member's storage space, a small zone of individual existence within the communal confines of the ship. The archaeologists photograph, measure, sketch, and record before touching, understanding that the act of recovery is also the act of destroying the artifact's original context forever. The medical instruments recovered from the wreck have proven particularly illuminating, offering a window into shipboard healthcare practices that historical documents only partially describe. Pewter syringes, their plungers still intact despite 3 centuries underwater, speak to the treatment of sexually transmitted infections, a constant concern among seafaring men who frequented ports where prostitution thrived alongside legitimate commerce. Surgical tools, scalpels and probes and devices whose purposes can only be guessed at reveal the brutal reality of medicine without anesthesia, without antiseptics, without antibiotics. The ship's surgeon, if she carried one, would have been expected to amputate shattered limbs while conscious patients screamed and fellow crew members held them down, to extract musket balls from wounds without x-rays to guide the search, to treat fevers and infections with remedies that range from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. A brass mortar and pestle recovered from the site speaks to the preparation of medications aboard the vessel, the grinding of herbs and minerals into powders and pastes according to formulas that reflected the medical understanding of the early 18th century. Calomel, a mercury compound, was a common treatment for numerous conditions, administered in doses that would be considered poisonous by modern standards. Laudanum, an opium preparation, offered the only reliable pain relief available, creating dependencies that were considered acceptable costs of treating otherwise unbearable suffering. The ship's medicine chest, if it survived intact somewhere in the debris field, would contain a pharmacopoeia of substances that reveal the beliefs and practices of an era when disease and injury killed far more sailors than combat or shipwreck. What stands remarkable about these medical finds is not their sophistication, but their presence at all. Pirates, in the popular imagination, appear as lawless men beyond the reach of civilization's comforts, men who accepted wounds and illness as the inevitable costs of their chosen profession. Yet the Queen Anne's Revenge carried medical supplies and almost certainly medical personnel, suggesting a level of organisation and foresight that complicates the romantic image of impulsive outlaws. Maintaining a crew's health was a practical necessity for any captain who wished to keep his vessel operational. Sick men could not fight, could not sail, could not contribute to the violent commerce upon which the ship's existence depended. The medical artefacts speak to this practicality, to the mundane concerns that underpinned even the most dramatic moments of piratical violence. Blackbeard himself understood the importance of managing his crew's well-being, though his methods extended beyond conventional medicine into the realm of psychological manipulation. Historical accounts describe him as cultivating an image of supernatural power, of demonic connection, that served to intimidate enemies and maintain authority over his own men. He reportedly tied slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle, creating a halo of smoke around his face that made him appear to have emerged from hell itself. This theatrical self-presentation was a deliberate strategy, a way of creating a reputation so terrifying that victims would surrender without resistance and crew members would think twice before challenging his authority. The artifacts cannot confirm or deny these specific details, but they do reveal a ship equipped for the kind of sustained operations that such reputation building required. Among the most significant finds have been the ship's anchors, massive iron assemblages that speak to the vessel's size and capabilities. An anchor's weight and design are determined by the vessel it serves. The need to hold position against wind and current while providing for quick release when circumstances demand departure. The anchors recovered from the Queen Anne's Revenge are consistent with a vessel of the La Concorde's documented dimensions, approximately 300 tons burden, large enough to carry significant cargo and crew, but manoeuvrable enough to pursue merchant vessels or flee from naval adversaries. The anchors show signs of heavy use, the wear patterns of chains and cables that were deployed and recovered countless times during the ship's working life. They also show modifications, alterations that may have been made during the vessel's conversion from merchant slave ship to pirate flagship. The matter of conversion deserves deeper examination, for the transformation of La Concorde into Queen Anne's Revenge required more than simply raising a new flag. A slave ship was designed and equipped for the specific purpose of human cargo, her hull configured with the removable platforms and ventilation systems needed to pack maximum numbers of captives into minimum space. A pirate vessel had different requirements entirely, needing speed and manoeuvrability for pursuit and escape, deck space for the crews that would board and subdue prizes, storage for the diverse cargo taken from vessels of every type and origin. Blackbeard and his men would have torn out the slave decks, reconfigured the hold, possibly strengthened the hull to support additional cannon. The ship that went down in 1718 was not quite the same vessel that had crossed the Middle Passage just months before, yet traces of her former purpose remain, embedded in the fabric of the wreck itself. The shackles and restraints recovered from the site speak to the human cargo that La Concorde carried during her final voyage as a slaver, the 455 Africans who were transported across the Atlantic, in conditions that defy modern comprehension. These were people, individuals with names and histories and families, reduced by the commerce of the era to cargo, to numbers in a manifest, to bodies whose value was calculated by age and health and capacity for labour. The shackles that held them have been found still locked, some of them still containing traces of the organic material, the skin and blood of those who wore them. The ocean preserved what the slavers would have preferred forgotten, the physical evidence of an industry that generated enormous wealth for European merchants and colonial planters while visiting incalculable suffering upon millions of African people. The relationship between piracy and slavery was complex and contradictory. Some pirates, including members of Blackbeard's crew, were themselves escaped or freed slaves who found in piracy an alternative to the bondage that awaited them in conventional colonial society. Black pirates served aboard many vessels of the Golden Age, sometimes as equals to their white crewmates, sometimes in subordinate positions that replicated the hierarchies of the legitimate world they had rejected. Historical records suggest that Blackbeard's crew included black members, though the details of their roles and treatment remain unclear. Did these men sail as free pirates, sharing in the risks and rewards of the enterprise, or did they occupy positions of servitude even within this ostensibly outlaw community? The artifacts cannot answer definitively, but the presence of slave trade implements alongside weapons and personal effects suggests a ship whose relationship to the institution of slavery was more complicated than simple opposition or participation. The cannon recovered from the site have become the wreck's most recognised artifacts, the objects that most powerfully evoke the vessel's capacity for violence. Each cannon has been individually catalogued and conserved, a process that has taken years of painstaking chemical treatment to halt the corrosion that threatened to destroy them. The weapons range from small swivel guns mounted on the ship's rail and used for anti-personnel fire during boarding actions, to massive long guns capable of throwing projectiles across significant distances. The diversity of types and calibers reflects the opportunistic nature of pirate armament. Unlike naval vessels supplied from centralised arsenals with standardised weapons, pirate ships accumulated their armament through capture, taking guns from prizes regardless of size or origin. The result was a heterogeneous collection that presented challenges for ammunition supply but offered flexibility in engagement. Analysis of the cannon has revealed details about their manufacture and use. Some bear foundry marks that identify their place of origin, Sweden or England or the Low Countries, the industrial centres that supplied the world's demand for cast iron weaponry. Others show evidence of repairs, cracks patched and bores relined by craftsmen working with limited facilities far from the foundries where such work was properly performed. The mouths of the cannon retain residue that chemical analysis can identify, traces of powder and shot that speak to the weapon's actual use in combat or intimidation. One cannon shows evidence of having been loaded but never fired, its charge still present after 3 centuries, a final round that was never spent because the ship went down before the opportunity arose. The shot recovered alongside the cannon reveals the variety of projectiles employed. Round shot, solid iron balls designed to punch holes in hulls and shatter masts, comprised the primary ammunition for ship-to-ship combat. Bar shot, 2 hemispheres connected by an iron bar, was designed to tumble through the air, slicing through rigging and sails to disable a vessel without sinking her. Grape shot, clusters of smaller balls bound together, spread upon firing to sweep decks of crew members, the naval equivalent of a giant shotgun blast. The presence of all these types aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge confirms that her crew was prepared for the full range of violent encounters that piracy entailed, from the intimidating display that encouraged surrender to the bloody close combat that became necessary when victims chose resistance. But the weapons tell only part of the story of life aboard this vessel. The daily routines of sailing, of maintenance, of simply existing in the cramped confines of a wooden ship occupied far more of the crew's time than combat or capture. Navigational instruments recovered from the site speak to the skills required to cross oceans without GPS or radar, relying instead on dead reckoning, celestial observation, and accumulated knowledge of currents and coastlines. A pair of dividers used for measuring distances on charts shows where patterns consistent with regular use over extended periods. Fragments of what may have been an astrolabe, though too corroded for certain identification, suggest the celestial navigation techniques that allowed 18th century mariners to determine their latitude with reasonable precision. The absence of certain expected artifacts is as significant as the presence of others. No ship's log has been recovered, no written records that might identify crew members by name or document the vessel's movements and captures. Such documents, if they existed, would likely have been made of paper or vellum, materials that deteriorate rapidly in seawater. Or perhaps they were removed before the ship went down, carried by officers who escaped the sinking and wished to preserve evidence of their activities, or destroyed deliberately to eliminate information that might have been used against them if captured. The silence of the missing record speaks to the limits of what material evidence can reveal. The questions that only written testimony could answer definitively. What the wreck does preserve is the physical reality of daily existence, the objects that crew members handled and consumed and discarded without thought for posterity. Pottery fragments, some showing traces of the glazes and decorations that identified their origins, speak to the diverse sources from which supplies were obtained. English stoneware sits alongside Portuguese earthenware and possibly Chinese porcelain, the detritus of a crew that provisioned itself from captures and port markets across the Atlantic world. Bone remnants, analysed to identify the animals from which they came, reveal a diet heavy in salted pork and beef, supplemented by fish caught during the voyage and the occasional exotic fare taken from captured vessels. Glass bottle fragments number among the most common finds, their green and brown and clear shards scattered across the debris field in concentrations that suggest where drinking occurred most frequently. Wine, rum and beer were staples of shipboard life, consumed not merely for pleasure but for practical necessity. Fresh water stored in wooden casks became foul and undrinkable within weeks, while alcohol resisted spoilage and provided calories that supplemented the limited diet available at sea. The historical record suggests that pirates were notorious for their consumption of alcohol, drinking more heavily than naval crews whose discipline prohibited such excess. The bottle fragments seem to confirm this reputation, their sheer number suggesting quantities of drink that would have kept the crew in a perpetual state of varying intoxication. The nature of authority aboard a pirate vessel differed markedly from the hierarchical structure of naval or merchant ships. While the captain held command during battle and chase, his authority at other times was limited by articles of agreement that crew members signed when joining the company. These articles, a form of constitution, established rules for the distribution of plunder, the settlement of disputes, and the removal of officers who failed to meet their responsibilities. The captain could be deposed by vote, replaced by a more capable or popular leader, in a system that represented an early form of democratic governance, at odds with the autocratic norms of the era. Blackbeard's success as a pirate captain depended not merely on his skill at violence, but on his ability to maintain the loyalty and confidence of men who retained the power to remove him. The artifacts recovered cannot directly illuminate these political structures, but they hint at them through their distribution patterns. Personal items, the pewter tableware and bone-handled utensils that individuals owned and maintained, appear scattered without clear hierarchy across the debris field. No captain's cabin with fine furnishings has been identified distinct from crew quarters, though the ship's deterioration may have obscured such distinctions. The relative egalitarianism of the material record aligns with historical accounts of pirate democracy, though it remains possible that future discoveries will reveal divisions not yet apparent. As excavation has progressed, the archaeologists have developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting information from objects that might seem unremarkable at first examination. X-ray fluorescence analysis reveals the chemical composition of metals, distinguishing between alloys and identifying trace elements that can indicate origin or use. Scanning electron microscopy allows examination at magnifications impossible to the naked eye, revealing tool marks, wear patterns, and manufacturing details that speak to how objects were made and used. Stable isotope analysis of organic materials can identify geographical origins, tracing the sources of food, bone, and wood through the chemical signatures left by local environments. Each technique opens new avenues of investigation, transforming apparently mute objects into eloquent witnesses. The wooden fragments of the hull itself have proven particularly rich sources of information. Beyond the dendrochronological dating that confirmed the vessel's French origins, analysis of the wood species and construction techniques has revealed details about shipbuilding practices in early 18th century France. The planking was fashioned from oak, the frames from a mix of oak and elm, woods selected for their specific properties of strength and flexibility. Copper sheathing, applied to the hull below the waterline, was intended to protect against the shipworms that could riddle wooden hulls in tropical waters, boring tunnels that weakened structural integrity and eventually caused catastrophic failure. The presence of this sheathing, a technology not yet universal in the early 1700s, suggests that La Concorde was built or refitted with Atlantic voyages specifically in mind. The copper itself tells a story of technological adaptation, of French shipwrights responding to the particular challenges of oceanic commerce in warm waters where the Teredo navalis, the common shipworm, could transform a sound hull into a honeycomb of weakness within a single season. These mollusks, despite their name, are not worms at all but bivalves, their shells reduced to rasping plates that allow them to bore into submerged wood with relentless efficiency. A ship that sailed only European waters might survive decades without significant worm damage, the cold northern seas inhospitable to these creatures. But a vessel intended for the Caribbean, for the African coast, for the warm currents where slaving voyages commenced and concluded, required protection that only metal could provide. The copper sheets recovered from the wreck site show the marks of their manufacture, the hammer blows that shaped them, the nail holes where they were fastened to the planking. Analysis of the copper's composition reveals trace elements consistent with European ore sources, likely from mines in Cornwall or perhaps the continent. The nails that secured these sheets were themselves copper, chosen to prevent the galvanic corrosion that would have occurred had iron nails been used with copper sheathing. This represents a sophisticated understanding of metallurgical principles, of the way dissimilar metals in contact with salt water create electrical currents that accelerate decay. The shipwrights who built La Concorde possessed knowledge that they may not have understood in scientific terms, but had learned through hard experience, through watching ships fail and deducing the causes of their failure. Yet even this protection could not save a vessel from the violence of capture, from the transformation that occurred when Blackbeard's forces took her and remade her into something else entirely. The refitting that converted La Concorde into Queen Anne's Revenge would have altered much of what the French builders had created, cutting new gun ports, reinforcing decks to bear the weight of cannon, stripping away whatever was deemed unnecessary for the purposes of war. The pirates cared nothing for the elegant lines that made a ship beautiful to maritime architects. They cared only for speed, for firepower, for the ability to intimidate and overwhelm. The modifications they made were practical adaptations for a vessel whose sole purpose was predation. transformation from slaver to pirate ship involved not merely physical alterations, but a kind of moral inversion that the material record can only hint at. La Concorde had been an instrument of human trafficking, her hold designed to maximise the number of captives who could be packed into her interior spaces. The suffering that occurred within those spaces during the Middle Passage defies adequate description. The horrors of confinement and disease and despair that claimed the lives of millions across the centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. When Blackbeard captured the vessel, he inherited this architecture of brutality, these spaces designed for the storage of human cargo. What did the pirates do with these spaces once the ship was theirs? The archaeological evidence suggests that the refitting removed or substantially altered the internal structures that had served the slave trade. The hold spaces were reconfigured for the storage of supplies, of plunder, of the provisions necessary to support a crew of several hundred men at sea for extended periods. The platforms and partitions that had confined enslaved Africans were likely torn out, the wood repurposed or discarded. Yet the ship carried the memory of its former function in its very bones, in the proportions of its hull and the layout of its decks. The ghosts of the Middle Passage sailed with the pirates whether they acknowledged this heritage or not. Among the artefacts recovered are shackles, iron restraints that speak with terrible eloquence of the enslaved people who had been held aboard La Concorde during her slaving voyages. These objects, rusted and encrusted but still recognisable, represent perhaps the most morally charged items in the entire collection. They were not installed by the pirates, but inherited from the ship's previous incarnation, left aboard perhaps from carelessness, perhaps from indifference, perhaps because iron was valuable and restraints might prove useful for any number of purposes. The presence of these shackles reminds us that the line between pirate and slaver was not as clear as romantic narratives might suggest. Pirates interacted with the slave trade in complex ways, sometimes liberating enslaved people, sometimes capturing and selling them, sometimes incorporating them into their crews. The historical record indicates that Blackbeard released the enslaved Africans aboard La Concorde when he captured her, though the circumstances of this release remain unclear. Were they set ashore, given their freedom in any meaningful sense, or simply abandoned as unwanted cargo? The documents do not say, and the archaeological evidence cannot answer such questions. What the shackles tell us is that the ship moved through a world where human beings could be treated as commodities, where the distinction between freedom and captivity was often determined by violence and chance. The pirates themselves occupied an ambiguous position in this world. They rejected the authority of nations that sanctioned slavery, yet they participated in the economic systems that the slave trade sustained. They offered freedom of a sort to those who joined their companies, yet this freedom existed only outside the boundaries of legal society, only so long as one remained useful and loyal. The medical instruments recovered from the site offer another lens through which to view shipboard life, revealing the efforts made to maintain the health of men engaged in a profession that exposed them constantly to injury and disease. Clister syringes, used for administering enemas, suggest attempts to treat digestive ailments through purgation, a common medical practice of the era. Urethral syringes indicate treatment for venereal diseases, afflictions that would have been common among men who frequented port towns and consorted with sex workers whenever the opportunity arose. Lancets for bloodletting reflect the humoral medical theory that still dominated Western medicine, the belief that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids, and that draining blood could restore this balance when illness disturbed it. The presence of these instruments raises questions about who performed medical duties aboard Queen Anne's Revenge. Pirate crews sometimes included surgeons, skilled practitioners who joined the company either voluntarily or under compulsion, their services too valuable to refuse. The articles of agreement that governed pirate vessels often specified compensation for injuries, payments scaled to the severity of the wound, suggesting that medical care was an expected part of the social contract that bound the crew together. A surgeon who could reset a broken bone, extract a bullet, or amputate a gangrenous limb was worth his share of the plunder and more. Yet the quality of this care would have been rudimentary by modern standards, limited by the state of medical knowledge and the conditions aboard ship. Without understanding of germ theory, without antibiotics or anaesthesia, without even basic sanitation, surgical intervention was often as dangerous as the injury it sought to address. The patient who survived having a limb removed might still succumb to infection days or weeks later, dying of sepsis in conditions that offered little comfort or cleanliness. The medical instruments from Queen Anne's Revenge are artefacts of this desperate struggle against bodily frailty, tools wielded in a losing battle against the inevitable consequences of violence, malnutrition, and exposure. The apothecary weights found amid the wreckage suggest that medications were prepared aboard ship, substances measured and compounded to treat the various ailments that afflicted the crew. Mercury, commonly used to treat syphilis despite its toxic effects, may have been among the substances administered. Opium would have been employed for pain relief, its addictive properties less concerning in an era when survival itself was uncertain. Herbal remedies, their efficacy ranging from genuine to non-existent, would have been prepared according to recipes passed down through generations of practitioners. The weights themselves, small brass objects calibrated to precise measurements, indicate a systematic approach to medicine that contrasts with the popular image of pirates as ignorant brutes. Even in their lawlessness, they sought to preserve the bodies that were their primary instruments of violence and survival. Pewter platters and bowls recovered from the site speak to the daily ritual of meals aboard ship, the regular consumption of food that marked the passage of hours and provided moments of social gathering amid the routines of sailing and waiting. The diet aboard pirate vessels would have been similar to that of naval and merchant ships, consisting primarily of hardtack, the twice-baked biscuits that could last for months without spoiling, along with salted meat, dried peas, and whatever fresh provisions could be obtained through raids or purchase. The monotony of this diet, its deficiency in vitamin C, led inevitably to scurvy among crews who remained at sea for extended periods, the disease that caused teeth to loosen, wounds to reopen, and eventually death if fresh fruits and vegetables were not consumed. Pirates, however, enjoyed certain advantages in avoiding scurvy compared to naval crews on long voyages. Their operational pattern involved frequent stops at ports and islands where fresh food could be obtained, their need for supplies drawing them to shore more often than vessels on transoceanic voyages. The Caribbean islands where Blackbeard operated offered abundant tropical fruits, citrus and mango and papaya, sources of the vitamins that prevented scurvy's progression. The archaeological evidence suggests that Queen Anne's Revenge carried livestock, bones of chickens and pigs appearing amid the debris, animals kept aboard as sources of fresh meat and eggs. This mobile larder would have supplemented the preserved provisions, providing occasional meals that broke the monotony of salt beef and hardtack. The tableware itself reveals something of the social hierarchies that existed despite pirate democracy. While no clearly separate officers' mess has been identified, the variety and quality among eating implements suggests that individuals possessed their own utensils, items of personal property that reflected their status, or simply their ability to acquire finer goods. Some pewter shows quality craftsmanship, well-made vessels that might have been purchased or plundered from wealthy victims. Other pieces are cruder, functional but lacking refinement, the sort of wear that common sailors might afford. This diversity suggests a shipboard society where equality in the division of plunder coexisted with individual differences in accumulated wealth and personal taste. Buttons, those humble fasteners of clothing, have proven unexpectedly informative about the appearance and origins of the crew. Recovered in significant numbers from the wreck site, they range from simple bone discs to elaborate brass affairs decorated with designs that speak to military or civilian fashion. The variety suggests that crew members dressed in whatever garments they could obtain, taking clothing from captured vessels and wearing it until it wore out. The image of pirates in matching uniforms is a Hollywood invention. In reality, a pirate crew would have presented a motley appearance, each man dressed according to his means and preferences, some in the fine coats of plundered gentlemen, others in the rough canvas of common sailors. The buttons also hint at the diverse origins of the crew. Some bear markings that identify their manufacture in England, others in France or Holland. The men who wore these buttons may have come from equally diverse backgrounds, drawn to piracy from different nations and different circumstances, united only by their willingness to live outside the law. The historical record suggests that Blackbeard's crew included men of various nationalities, including significant numbers of Africans, both formerly enslaved and freeborn. This diversity was common among pirate crews, whose egalitarian structures made them more welcoming to men who faced discrimination elsewhere. A black sailor who might be treated as inferior aboard a naval vessel could find something closer to equality among pirates, though racism certainly existed within pirate communities, as it did throughout colonial society. The navigational instruments recovered hint at the technical skills necessary to operate a vessel across the open ocean. While no complete sextant or astrolabe has been identified, fragments suggest the presence of such instruments, tools for determining latitude through observation of celestial bodies, dividers for measuring distances on charts, parallel rules for plotting courses. These are the implements of the navigator's art, skills that separated competent sailors from mere passengers. Someone aboard Queen Anne's Revenge possessed the knowledge to read the stars, to calculate position, to guide the vessel through waters where landmarks were absent and only the sun and stars provided orientation. This navigation occurred without the benefit of accurate longitude determination, a problem that would not be solved until John Harrison's chronometer proved itself decades later. Pirates, like all sailors of the early 18th century, relied on dead reckoning, estimating their position based on speed, time and direction travelled since the last known position. This method accumulated errors with each passing day, requiring regular correction through coastal sightings or other landmarks. The Caribbean, with its many islands and distinctive features, offered more opportunities for such correction than the open Atlantic, but even there vessels could find themselves significantly off course after extended periods at sea. The lead lines recovered from the wreck were essential tools for coastal navigation, weighted lines marked at intervals that allowed sailors to determine water depth beneath the keel. Approaching unfamiliar shorelines, threading through channels where shoals might lurk, the leadsman's regular calls provided crucial information to the helmsman. The tallow applied to the lead's bottom brought up samples of the seafloor, sand or mud or shell that could be compared to chart notations indicating bottom characteristics at various depths. Through such methods, experienced navigators could identify their position even in darkness or fog, recognizing the feel of the bottom beneath them as a blind person might recognize familiar terrain through touch. Cannon shot of various calibers speaks to the range of artillery that Queen Anne's Revenge carried, the weapons that gave the vessel its formidable reputation. Round shot, the solid iron spheres that were the primary projectile of the era appear in sizes corresponding to the various cannon known to have been aboard. These would have been used against the hulls and rigging of target vessels, their impact capable of shattering planking and bringing down masts. Bar shot, two halves of a sphere connected by an iron bar, spun through the air designed to cut rigging and disable a vessel without sinking it, preservation of potential prizes being preferable to their destruction. Grape shot, clusters of smaller iron balls packed together, would have been devastating against personnel exposed on deck, the shotgun blast of naval warfare that could clear an enemy ship of defenders in a single discharge. The pirates, whose goal was typically to capture rather than destroy, would have used grape shot primarily as a threat. The promise of its terrible effect encouraging surrender before boarding became necessary. The psychological warfare that preceded actual combat may have been more important than the combat itself, intimidation saving ammunition and lives on both sides. The presence of grenades among the recovered artifacts adds another dimension to the picture of pirate armament. These small explosive devices, iron shells filled with gunpowder and equipped with slow-burning fuses, could be thrown onto enemy decks during the close quarters of boarding actions. Their explosion would scatter iron fragments in all directions, wounding or killing anyone nearby, creating chaos and terror that would further demoralize resistance. The pirates who carried these weapons understood that violence, both actual and threatened, was their primary tool, the fear they inspired often more effective than the harm they inflicted. The process of conservation that preserves these artifacts for study and display is itself a kind of archaeology, a deliberate and painstaking intervention that reveals as it protects. When an iron object is removed from the seabed, the chloride ions that have penetrated its structure during centuries of immersion continue their corrosive work unless arrested through chemical treatment. The conservators at the laboratory in Greenville, North Carolina, subject these objects to lengthy desalination, soaking them in baths of distilled water or chemical solutions that gradually draw out the destructive salts. This process can take years, the water changed regularly, its chloride levels measured until they fall below the threshold that indicates adequate treatment. Only after this desalination can the mechanical cleaning begin, the careful removal of concretion and corrosion products that obscure the original surfaces. Conservators work under magnification, wielding dental picks and air-abrasive tools to chip away the accretions without damaging what lies beneath. Each layer removed is photographed and documented, the information it contains recorded before it is discarded. The goal is not to restore objects to their original appearance, but to stabilise them in a condition that reveals their character while preventing further decay. Some corrosion products may be left in place, their contribution to understanding the object's history outweighing the aesthetic preference for pristine surfaces. The tannic acid treatment applied to iron objects creates a chemical barrier against future corrosion, converting the unstable corrosion products into more stable compounds while simultaneously darkening the surface in a way that enhances contrast and legibility. This treatment, developed through decades of conservation research, represents a careful balance between intervention and preservation, between making objects accessible and maintaining their integrity. The conservators who perform this work understand that they are mediating between past and future, that the choices they make will determine what future researchers can learn from these artefacts. The anchor from Queen Anne's Revenge presents one of the most compelling artefacts to emerge from the excavation, a massive iron hook that once held the vessel fast against wind and current. Weighing over 3,000 pounds when first raised from the sediment, encrusted with concretion that had built up over nearly 3 centuries of submersion, this single object speaks to the scale of the ship it served and the forces it was designed to resist. The anchor's recovery in 2011 marked a significant milestone in the excavation, a visual symbol of the project's ambitions that captured public attention in ways that smaller artefacts could not. Yet for archaeologists, the anchor represents far more than spectacle. Its design, its dimensions, its state of preservation all contribute information about 18th century maritime technology and about the specific circumstances of Queen Anne's Revenge. The conservation of this anchor required facilities and techniques commensurate with its size. The laboratory constructed a tank large enough to accommodate the artefact, a specialised containment vessel that would hold the chemical solutions necessary for desalination. For years, the anchor sat submerged in these baths, the chloride ions that had penetrated its iron structure gradually leaching out into the surrounding liquid. Conservators monitored the process, testing the water at regular intervals, waiting for the moment when the concentrations fell below acceptable thresholds. Only then could the mechanical cleaning begin. The laborious removal of concretion that had bonded so tightly to the original surface that distinguishing one from the other required constant vigilance. The process revealed details invisible beneath the marine growth, the original forging marks left by the blacksmiths who had created this tool, the wear patterns that spoke to its use aboard ship, the damage that hinted at the violence of the grounding that had ended Queen Anne's Revenge's career. What makes an anchor more than simply a weight is the precision of its design, the careful calculation of forces that allows it to grip the seabed against the pull of wind and tide. The flukes, those curved projecting arms that dig into sand or mud, must be angled correctly to bite rather than drag. The shank, the central shaft connecting crown to ring, must be strong enough to resist the tremendous stresses transmitted through the anchor cable. The ring at the top, where the cable attaches, must be robust enough to bear loads that could exceed the anchor's own weight many times over during storms. Every element serves a function, and the design of 18th century anchors represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to keep vessels safely moored. The anchor from Queen Anne's Revenge, massive as it is, would have been only one of several aboard, the vessel carrying anchors of different sizes for different circumstances. The bower anchors, the largest, would have been deployed routinely during ordinary anchorage. Smaller kedge anchors could be used for manoeuvring, carried out by boat and dropped to windward so that the ship could be pulled forward against unfavourable conditions. The loss of anchors was common in the era, cables parting under strain or anchors snagging on obstacles that refused to release them, and ships carried spares against such eventualities. How many anchors went down with Queen Anne's Revenge? How many had been lost during the vessel's career before that final grounding? The seabed has not yet yielded complete answers to these questions, the sediment still holding secrets that future excavation seasons may reveal. The study of Queen Anne's Revenge extends beyond the physical artefacts to encompass the historical records that document Blackbeard's brief but spectacular career. These records, scattered across colonial archives on both sides of the Atlantic, provide context that transforms recovered objects from curiosities into evidence. The letters written by colonial governors, the depositions taken from captured pirates and their victims, the newspaper accounts that spread tales of Blackbeard's exploits throughout the Atlantic world. All these textual sources illuminate the world from which the artefacts emerged. When archaeologists recover a pewter syringe from the wreck site, the historical record helps them understand how such medical instruments functioned within the social ecology of a pirate ship. When they find evidence of the slave trade, the records document the specific vessels that Blackbeard intercepted, the cargoes they carried, the fates of those aboard. This marriage of archaeology and history, of material evidence and documentary evidence, produces understanding richer than either could achieve alone. Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina occupies a complicated position in the historical narrative of Blackbeard's career. It was Eden who granted Blackbeard the pardon that temporarily legitimised his presence in the colony, Eden before whom the pirate appeared to surrender his ship and swear his loyalty to the crown. The relationship between the two men has been the subject of speculation ever since, historians debating whether Eden was a corrupt official complicit in Blackbeard's crimes, or simply a pragmatic administrator making the best of difficult circumstances. The documents that survive offer no definitive answers, their formal language concealing whatever personal understandings may have existed between governor and pirate. What the records do make clear is that Blackbeard operated with remarkable openness during his months in North Carolina, anchoring in Pamlico Sound, conducting himself almost as a respectable merchant captain, even marrying a local woman with apparent official sanction. This period of quasi-legitimacy came to an end only when Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, decided that Blackbeard's presence represented a threat that extended beyond North Carolina's borders. Spotswood's decision to send naval forces into another colony's waters without coordinating with Eden or seeking permission from London demonstrates the urgency with which some officials viewed the pirate problem. The expedition that would kill Blackbeard was itself of questionable legality, a fact that would complicate efforts to distribute the prize money afterward. The boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate violence, between authorised warfare and criminal piracy, were more porous than official rhetoric acknowledged. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the naval officer who commanded the expedition against Blackbeard, left his own account of the battle that took place in November of 1718, a document that historians have analysed for nearly 3 centuries. His small sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, carried no mounted cannon, their crews relying entirely on small arms and hand-to-hand combat. When they engaged Blackbeard's vessel in the shallows of Ocracoke Inlet, the pirates' superior firepower initially seemed decisive. A broadside from Adventure's guns swept across Maynard's decks, killing or wounding a substantial portion of his crew. What happened next has become the stuff of legend, Maynard concealing his surviving men below deck, luring Blackbeard into believing the sloop was defeated, then springing the trap when the pirates boarded. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brutal and brief, Blackbeard himself fighting until his last breath despite wounds that would have killed most men several times over. The accounts speak of 5 gunshot wounds and 20 cuts from swords and cutlasses, a testament to either the pirate's ferocity or the exaggeration that coloured all tales of his exploits. When the fighting ended, Blackbeard was dead, his head severed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit as proof of the deed. The image of that grisly trophy sailing back to Virginia has become iconic, the final curtain on a career that had lasted barely 2 years, but left a mark on history disproportionate to its duration. The artefacts from Queen Anne's Revenge cannot tell us what passed through Blackbeard's mind during those final months, cannot explain why a man who had accepted a royal pardon would return to piracy so quickly, or why he chose to remain in waters so close to the colonial settlements that had shown him hospitality. They cannot tell us whether the grounding of Queen Anne's Revenge was truly accidental, or, as some have suggested, a deliberate act designed to reduce the number of men among whom plunder would be divided. The contemporary account provided by one of Blackbeard's crew, a man named David Heriot, who served as sailing master of one of the pirates' smaller vessels, suggests the latter interpretation. Heriot claimed that Blackbeard had intentionally run his ships aground, then departed with his favourites and a substantial portion of the treasure, leaving the rest to fend for themselves on the sandbar. If true, this act of betrayal reveals something significant about the social dynamics of pirate crews, the tensions between solidarity and self-interest that must have shaped daily life aboard these floating criminal enterprises. The artefacts cannot resolve this question definitively, but they may contain clues that future analysis will illuminate. The distribution of materials across the wreck site, the pattern of damage to the hull, the presence or absence of certain expected cargoes. All these factors contribute to an interpretation that continues to evolve as excavation proceeds. One category of artifact that has drawn particular attention from researchers involves the remains of botanical materials recovered from the wreck. Seeds, plant fragments, and other organic traces survive only under exceptional circumstances in marine environments, their preservation requiring conditions that exclude the organisms that would otherwise consume them. Yet the anaerobic sediments beneath the wreck have yielded evidence of the plants that once travelled aboard Queen Anne's Revenge, their presence documenting the diet and medicinal practices of the crew. Fig seeds, for example, appear among the recovered materials, their small size and resistant structure allowing them to survive where softer plant tissues have long since vanished. Figs were common provisions aboard sailing vessels, their dried form allowing long storage without refrigeration. The same qualities that made them useful to ancient Mediterranean sailors made them valuable to 18th century pirates, their sweetness providing calories and their fibre contributing to diets otherwise heavy in salt meat and hardtack. Other plant remains hint at more specialised uses. The seeds of certain species known for their medicinal properties suggest the presence of a pharmacological repertoire aboard the vessel, remedies for the ailments that plagued maritime populations. The full analysis of these botanical materials continues, each identification adding another thread to the understanding of life aboard a pirate ship. The question of food and provisioning opens broader considerations about the logistics of piracy. A vessel the size of Queen Anne's Revenge, carrying a crew that may have numbered well over 100 men at peak strength, required constant replenishment of stores. Water, in particular, presented ongoing challenges. Unlike food, which could be preserved through salting, smoking or drying, fresh water simply deteriorated over time, growing stagnant in casks that harboured bacteria and algae. Ships had to put in regularly to replenish their water supplies, a necessity that limited their range and shaped their patterns of movement. Preserved foods provided more flexibility, their long shelf life allowing voyages that might stretch across many weeks without touching land. But even preserved foods eventually ran out, and the caloric demands of heavy manual labour meant that crews consumed substantial quantities every day. Pirates, operating outside the supply chains that supported legitimate merchant vessels, had to acquire their provisions through capture or purchase, their movements constrained by the constant need to resupply. The artefacts from Queen Anne's Revenge document some of this provisioning activity, though the evidence is fragmentary. Storage containers, utensils, and the remains of foodstuffs all appear among the recovered materials, their presence attesting to the mundane necessities that underpinned even the most romantic of pirate adventures. The pewter tableware that has emerged from the wreck offers glimpses into the social organisation of meals aboard ship. Plates, bowls and spoons of pewter were common aboard vessels of this era, their durability and relatively low cost making them practical for shipboard use. Unlike ceramic tableware, pewter would not shatter if dropped during rough weather, and its metallic surface could be cleaned and reused indefinitely. The presence of such items aboard Queen Anne's Revenge suggests that at least some members of the crew ate from individual vessels rather than communal pots, a small indication of shipboard customs that documents rarely describe. Whether such distinctions corresponded to rank within the pirate hierarchy, or whether they simply reflected personal property that individual pirates had acquired through capture or purchase, remains uncertain. The traditional image of pirate crews as egalitarian brotherhoods, sharing food and drink as equals, may have some basis in the democratic principles that governed the distribution of plunder and the election of captains. But everyday life aboard ship inevitably involved distinctions and hierarchies, patterns of deference and authority that would have been invisible to the official records that documented piracy only from the outside. The artefacts offer the possibility of reconstructing these hidden social structures, their distribution and character providing evidence that contemporary observers never thought to record. The surgical instruments that have emerged from Queen Anne's Revenge present some of the most visually striking artefacts from the excavation. Urethral syringes, with their long metal shafts designed for injecting medications directly into the bladder, speak to the prevalence of venereal diseases among maritime populations. Clister pump components, used for administering enemas, represent another form of medical intervention common in the era's therapeutic repertoire. Bloodletting was fundamental to 18th century medicine, practiced aboard ships as ashore, though the instruments for this procedure have proven more difficult to identify among the recovered materials. What makes this medical assemblage significant is not merely its presence, but its quantity and quality. The number of surgical instruments recovered suggests either an unusually well-equipped ship's medicine chest or the accumulated plunder from multiple captured vessels that happened to carry medical supplies. Given that Queen Anne's Revenge was known to have intercepted slave ships, which routinely carried medical equipment for their terrible commerce in human beings, the latter interpretation seems plausible. The surgeons who sailed aboard slavers bore responsibility for keeping enslaved people alive during the Middle Passage, their skills deployed in service of the trade's economic logic. When pirates captured such vessels, the medical supplies would have been valuable prizes, transferable to new uses aboard the pirate ship itself. The presence of a surgeon or someone functioning in that capacity aboard Queen Anne's Revenge is suggested by this concentration of medical artefacts. Pirate articles, the written agreements that governed the internal organisation of pirate crews, typically provided for compensation to crew members who suffered injuries in the course of their work. A man who lost a limb might receive a set payment from the Common Fund, a form of disability insurance centuries before such programs became standard in legitimate employment. This compensation system implied the presence of someone capable of performing the necessary surgery, someone who could amputate shattered limbs before gangrene set in, who could extract musket balls from wounds, who could treat the illnesses that spread rapidly in the close confines of shipboard life. Whether this surgeon was a trained professional who had chosen to join the pirates, a captured ship's surgeon pressed into service, or simply a crew member with some relevant experience, the records do not reveal. The instruments themselves testify to medical capabilities that would have been valuable in a world where injury and disease were constant companions. The ship's bell that once hung aboard Queen Anne's Revenge has not been positively identified among the recovered artefacts, a notable absence given the significance of bells in maritime culture. The ship's bell served multiple functions aboard an 18th century vessel. Its regular ringing marked the passage of watches, the half-hourly intervals that divided the working day into manageable portions. 8 bells marked the end of a 4-hour watch, the crew rotating through their duties according to a schedule that the bell made audible to all aboard. The bell also served as an alarm, its rapid ringing summoning hands to stations during emergencies. And it carried legal significance, its inscription typically identifying the vessel and its year of launch, providing evidence of identity that could be important in Admiralty courts. The absence of an identified bell from Queen Anne's Revenge may simply reflect the conditions of preservation, the bronze or brass alloy potentially surviving differently than iron and pewter in the marine environment. Or it may indicate that the bell was among items removed before the grounding, taken by departing crew or lost during earlier phases of the vessel's career. Future excavation may yet reveal this artefact, its discovery representing a moment of connection with the vessel's daily rhythms that would resonate powerfully with contemporary audiences. The study of Queen Anne's Revenge has unfolded across nearly 3 decades since the wreck's initial discovery, a timeline that reflects both the complexity of underwater archaeology and the deliberate pace appropriate to scientific investigation. Each season of fieldwork builds upon what came before, the accumulating knowledge shaping decisions about where to excavate next, which artefacts to prioritise for recovery, and how to interpret what emerges from the sediment. The principal investigators who have guided this work understand that their responsibilities extend beyond the immediate project to encompass future researchers who will inherit the collection and continue its study long after the current team has retired from active work. This long view shapes every decision, from the granularity of record keeping to the selection of conservation treatments to the standards for publication and data sharing. The knowledge generated by the Queen Anne's Revenge project will outlive those who create it, becoming part of a permanent scientific record accessible to researchers around the world. The sediment that has cradled these artefacts for 3 centuries continues to yield its secrets with a patience that mirrors the deliberate methodology of those who sift through it. Each dive season brings fresh discoveries, some anticipated by the archaeological team based on their evolving understanding of the site's structure, others emerging as complete surprises that reshape interpretations developed over years of careful study. The work proceeds at what might seem to outsiders an agonizingly slow pace, but this measured approach reflects hard-won wisdom about the irreversible nature of archaeological excavation. Once sediment is removed, once an artefact is lifted from its context, the physical relationship between objects that has persisted since 1718 is permanently altered. There are no second chances in this discipline. no opportunity to return an artifact to its original position and excavate it again with better methods or fuller understanding. The Queen Anne's Revenge team operates with constant awareness that they are not merely recovering interesting objects, but generating scientific knowledge that must withstand scrutiny from future researchers equipped with analytical techniques not yet imagined. The conservation laboratory, where recovered artifacts undergo treatment, represents a continuation of the excavation process, not a separate endeavour. Here, the slow work of stabilisation and analysis proceeds year-round, independent of diving seasons and weather conditions. Objects that spent centuries in equilibrium with their marine environment must be carefully transitioned to atmospheric conditions that would otherwise cause rapid deterioration. Iron artifacts saturated with chloride ions from seawater would crumble to powder within weeks if simply allowed to dry, the salt crystals expanding as moisture evaporates, shattering the metal from within. The conservation process involves extended soaking in chemical baths that gradually replace the chlorides with more stable compounds, a treatment that can require years for heavily corroded objects. This timeline tests institutional patience, but rewards it with artifacts that will remain stable for centuries to come, their scientific and educational value preserved for generations not yet born. The commitment to proper conservation represents a form of faith in the future, a belief that what we save today will matter to people we will never meet. Among the most evocative categories of artifacts recovered from the site are those that speak to the daily rhythms of shipboard existence. Fragments of ceramic vessels, their origins traceable through analysis of clay composition and decorative styles, reveal the diversity of goods that circulated through Atlantic trade networks. Some pieces originated in European manufactories, their standardized forms reflecting industrial production processes that were transforming material culture across the Western world. Others show characteristics of Caribbean or American workshops, evidence of local production traditions developing in colonial settings. Still others defy easy classification, their hybrid features suggesting the creative improvisation that characterized life on the maritime frontier. The broken edges of these vessels mark moments of accident or violence, cups dropped in rough seas, plates shattered during boarding actions, storage jars cracked as cargo shifted in the hold. Each fragment preserves a trace of human handling. Fingerprints, sometimes literally visible in the glaze, evidence of the individual hands that made, used, and ultimately discarded these objects. The accumulation of such mundane artifacts creates a texture of lived experience that official documents and contemporary accounts cannot convey, the irreducible particularity of daily life aboard a vessel whose very existence challenged the categories that organized the Atlantic world. The fauna remains recovered from the site. The bones of animals consumed aboard the vessel offer a window into the provisioning practices that sustained pirate operations. Analysis of these bones reveals the species consumed, the butchering techniques employed, and in some cases the geographic origins of the animals themselves. The presence of certain species suggests trade with specific regions, while the age and condition of slaughtered animals speaks to the quality of provisions available. Pirate vessels face particular challenges in obtaining fresh supplies, their dubious legal status limiting access to legitimate ports where merchant ships routinely replenish stores. This constraint forced pirates to develop alternative supply networks, raiding for provisions as well as cargo, trading with merchants willing to overlook their profession in exchange for favourable prices, and exploiting the hospitality of colonial outposts that existed in the grey zones of imperial authority. The animal bones recovered from Queen Anne's Revenge carry traces of these supply strategies, mundane evidence of logistical necessities that shaped pirate movements as surely as wind and current. The plant remains preserved in the site's anaerobic sediments provide complementary evidence about diet and trade. Seeds, nutshells, and other botanical materials survived conditions that destroyed most organic matter, their cellular structures protected by the absence of oxygen that would otherwise permit bacterial decay. These remnants of meals long consumed offer insights into nutrition, food preparation practices, and the geographic range of pirate provisioning. Some plant materials clearly originated in European contexts, familiar crops that crossed the Atlantic with colonizing populations. Others represent New World species, evidence of engagement with American food traditions that were transforming European diets during this period. Still others suggest African origins, plants associated with the slave trade that may have accompanied human cargo, or been adopted by crews with diverse cultural backgrounds. The botanical assemblage from Queen Anne's Revenge reflects the Atlantic world's character as a zone of biological exchange where species from multiple continents mingled and combined in unprecedented ways. The pirates who consumed these foods participated in ecological transformations that would reshape global agriculture, their daily meals connecting them to processes operating at scales far beyond their awareness or concern. The weapons recovered from the site command particular attention, their lethal purpose contrasting sharply with the domestic artifacts that surrounded them. Beyond the cannons, whose recovery marked major milestones in the project's history, the excavation has yielded smaller arms that would have been employed in close combat. Grenades designed to be lit and thrown onto enemy decks during boarding actions have emerged from the sediment, their iron bodies still bearing traces of the pyrotechnic compositions that would have showered targets with flame and shrapnel. These weapons speak to the violence that underwrote pirate enterprise, the willingness to kill that transformed robbery from mere theft into something approaching warfare. The men who handled these grenades understood their purpose without illusion, preparing implements of destruction that would maim and kill fellow human beings. That understanding coexisted with the camaraderie and rough democracy that characterized pirate social organization, the violence directed outward at enemies and victims rather than internally at shipmates. The grenades preserved in marine sediment carry this paradox. These instruments of brutal assault crafted by hands that also shared food, made music, and voted on collective decisions. The contradictions of pirate life resist easy resolution, and the material evidence recovered from Queen Anne's Revenge refuses to simplify them. Cutlasses and other edged weapons have also emerged from the wreck, their blades corroded but still recognizable as the tools of close-quarters combat that followed successful boarding actions. These weapons were designed for fighting in confined spaces, their relatively short blades suited to the cramped conditions between decks where longer swords would have been impractical. The curved blade, typical of the cutlass, delivered devastating cutting blows, its geometry optimized for slashing attacks against opponents who might be encountered at unexpected angles. The men who wielded these weapons trained for a specific form of combat, the chaotic violence of shipboard fighting, where individual skill combined with collective tactics to overwhelm defenders. Some of the cutlasses recovered from Queen Anne's Revenge show evidence of use, their edges bearing the marks of contact with other metal, with wood, perhaps with bone. These traces of violence persist across 3 centuries, tangible evidence of moments when these blades were swung in earnest against human targets. The proximity of such weapons to domestic artifacts in the archaeological record captures something essential about pirate experience, the constant readiness for violence that accompanied the mundane routines of eating, sleeping, and maintaining ship and equipment. Small arms designed for use by individual crew members have added further dimensions to understanding the vessel's armament. Pistols and their component parts appear in the archaeological record, fragmentary but identifiable as the personal weapons that pirates would have carried during boarding actions and shore raids. These were weapons of close range, most effective at the distances across which voices could be heard and faces recognized. Their presence in the archaeological record suggests the distribution of firepower among crew members, a democratization of lethality that distinguished pirate vessels from legitimate warships, where arms might be more centrally controlled. The ability of ordinary crew members to possess and use firearms reflected the social organization of pirate companies, where authority derived from consent rather than commission, where captains could be deposed by vote if they lost the confidence of their crews. The small arms scattered across the wreck site represent this dispersed power structure in material form, weapons in the hands of men who used them according to collective decisions rather than hierarchical orders. The personal effects recovered from the site, buttons, buckles, rings, and other small items of adornment, carry a particular poignancy, their intimate association with individual bodies, reminding us that the ship's company comprised distinct persons with their own histories, relationships, and inner lives. A button that once fastened a coat has outlasted the coat, the body that wore it, and all memory of the individual who walked the deck of Queen Anne's Revenge in the months before its grounding. These small artifacts are the most personal traces of the men who sailed with Blackbeard, objects that touched their skin, that accompanied their movements through daily routines, that were seen and perhaps commented upon by shipmates. The accumulation of such items across the site represents the collective presence of a crew now otherwise lost to history, individual men whose names survive in no record, whose stories ended in ways we cannot know. Some may have died at Beaufort Inlet or shortly thereafter, victims of disease, violence, or the hazards inherent in early 18th century maritime life. Others may have lived long lives under assumed identities, their piratical careers a secret known only to themselves and those who chose not to expose them. The artefacts they left behind aboard the wrecked vessel connect us to these unknowable futures, personal objects that outlasted the persons who owned them by centuries. The study of Queen Anne's Revenge has transformed understanding not only of this specific vessel, but of the entire phenomenon of Atlantic piracy during the Golden Age. Before systematic archaeological investigation began, knowledge of pirate material culture derived primarily from documents and images, sources that were created by and for people who had reasons to distort or sensationalize their subjects. The actual objects used by pirates existed largely in imagination, their forms and qualities inferred from textual descriptions rather than direct observation. The recovery of thousands of artifacts from a confirmed pirate vessel has provided a corrective to these imaginative reconstructions, grounding understanding in material evidence that can be examined, measured, analysed, and compared. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of pirate life that is simultaneously more mundane and more complex than popular legend suggested. The pirates of Queen Anne's Revenge used ordinary tools and consumed ordinary foods and wore ordinary clothing, their daily existence not dramatically different from that of sailors aboard legitimate vessels. Yet the purposes to which they directed their labour, the social structures within which they organised their collective life, and the relationship they maintained with established authority set them apart from their contemporaries in ways that continue to fascinate and provoke. The ongoing analysis of artefacts from the site continues to generate new insights, even as decades pass since the initial discovery. Conservation treatments that require years to complete eventually yield stabilised artefacts ready for detailed study. Analytical techniques that did not exist when excavation began now permit investigations that earlier researchers could not have imagined. The collection serves as a scientific resource not for a single project, with a defined endpoint, but for generations of scholarship yet to come. Questions we do not yet know how to ask will be directed at evidence we have already recovered, future researchers building upon foundations laid by those who work the site today. This temporal extension of the project beyond any individual career or institutional commitment gives the work a significance that transcends immediate discoveries, positioning Queen Anne's Revenge as a permanent resource for understanding the early 18th century Atlantic world. The ship that sank near Beaufort Inlet in 1718 has become, 3 centuries later, a lens through which the whole era can be brought into sharper focus. The transformation of Queen Anne's Revenge from lost ship to active archaeological site to permanent collection and research facility marks a particular kind of redemption for a vessel whose original purpose was destruction and theft. The ship that once carried cannon and cutlass, that once pursued and captured its prey across Caribbean waters, now yields knowledge rather than plunder. The violence embedded in its history, the suffering inflicted by the slave trade that created its previous incarnation as La Concorde, the terror of its victims during Blackbeard's brief but memorable command. These dark dimensions of the vessel's past are not erased by its transformation into an object of scientific study. Rather, they are illuminated by that study, their reality documented through evidence that does not permit denial or romanticization. The medical instruments that may have kept enslaved people alive long enough to be sold, the grenades that would have maimed and killed, the small personal items that mark the presence of men whose choices brought suffering to others. All of this material evidence demands moral engagement alongside scientific analysis. The Queen Anne's Revenge collection is not merely interesting, but also troubling. Its artefacts connecting us to historical realities that complicate easy celebration of pirate adventure. The waters of Beaufort Inlet continue to flow over the site, the same currents that have moved across this location for millennia persisting in their patterns, while human meanings accumulated and transformed around them. Storms still sweep in from the Atlantic, their power scattering whatever is not sufficiently anchored, redistributing the sediments that cover whatever the archaeologists have not yet recovered. The inlet remains what it has always been, a meeting of water and land, a threshold between the open sea and the protected sounds beyond, a place where vessels have always faced risk, and where many besides Queen Anne's Revenge have met their ends. The wreck site exists within this larger context of natural process, human time scales intersecting with geological ones, the few decades of archaeological work occupying a sliver of the centuries during which the ship's remains have rested on the bottom. The project will eventually conclude, its formal excavation phase ending when the significant deposits have been recorded and recovered. But the site will persist, its residual materials continuing to interact with the marine environment, its coordinates marked on charts as a reminder of what lies beneath the waves. The legacy of the Queen Anne's Revenge project extends beyond the specific artefacts recovered and the specific knowledge generated. It encompasses the methods developed and refined through decades of work, methodologies that will shape future projects at other sites. It includes the public engagement that has made this excavation among the most visible archaeological investigations in American history, the outreach that has connected millions of people to the work of underwater archaeology and the history of Atlantic piracy. It embraces the training of new generations of specialists who began their careers on this project and will carry its standards and perspectives into their own future work. And it embodies a commitment to making the fruits of publicly funded research available to the public that funded it. The artifacts held in trust for the citizens of North Carolina, and the knowledge shared through publications, exhibitions, and educational programs accessible to all. The project models what public archaeology can accomplish when sustained political and institutional support aligns with rigorous scientific practice and genuine public interest. In the final analysis, the study of Queen Anne's Revenge returns us to questions that archaeology alone cannot answer. What drove men to abandon legitimate maritime careers for the risks and violence of piracy? What did they believe they were doing, and how did they justify their choices to themselves and each other? What sense did they make of lives lived outside the boundaries of respectable society, pursuing wealth through methods that could result in execution if they were caught? These questions require understanding that extends beyond the material record into realms of motivation, meaning, and moral reasoning that leave no physical traces. The artifacts can tell us what pirates used, what they ate, what they wore, where their goods originated, and how they were made. They cannot tell us what pirates thought, what they felt, what they dreamed in the hours before dawn when the watch was quiet and the stars wheeled overhead. These interior dimensions of human experience remain beyond archaeological recovery, accessible only through inference and imagination. Yet the material evidence grounds such imaginative reconstruction in ways that purely documentary sources cannot. Standing before a recovered cannon, tracing the corrosion patterns that mark centuries of marine submersion, one confronts an object that Blackbeard himself may have touched, that fired upon vessels whose crews faced the choice of surrender or resistance, that contributed to the terror that made the pirate's name synonymous with maritime menace. This connection, across time, operates through physical continuity, the same atoms that composed the cannon in 1718 composing it still, rearranged by corrosion but never destroyed. The artifact serves as a bridge between past and present, a material link connecting contemporary consciousness to historical experience. Such connections cannot substitute for understanding, but they provide an anchor for understanding that purely abstract knowledge lacks. The canons of Queen Anne's Revenge are not merely interesting historical facts, but present physical realities, objects that can be seen and touched and photographed, objects whose existence does not depend on anyone's testimony or interpretation. The ship that Edward Teach once commanded has become, against all expectation, one of the most intensively studied vessels of its era. What sank as a pirate flagship has emerged as a scientific resource. What lay forgotten in murky waters has risen to prominence in public consciousness. What might have remained a legend has become a documented archaeological site, its coordinates precisely known, its artifacts catalogued and conserved, its significance established through decades of rigorous investigation. This transformation from pirate vessel to permanent collection marks a kind of immortality that Blackbeard himself could not have imagined, his ship achieving an endurance in human memory that far exceeds its brief operational career. The brief months during which Queen Anne's Revenge served as a pirate flagship pale against the centuries during which it has rested on the bottom, and those centuries pale against the indefinite future during which its recovered artifacts will serve as evidence about the past. The vessel's second life has become far longer than its first, its significance growing rather than fading as time passes. When the last artefacts have been recovered from Beaufort Inlet, when the final conservation treatments have been completed, when the last publications have been written, and the last exhibitions mounted, the Queen Anne's Revenge collection will continue to exist as a permanent resource for understanding a vanished world. Researchers not yet born will pose questions we cannot anticipate to evidence we have already gathered, their inquiries shaped by concerns we cannot imagine. The collection will wait for them, preserved in climate-controlled facilities, documented in databases that will themselves be migrated through successive technological platforms available to whoever demonstrates the competence and commitment to study it responsibly. This is the deeper meaning of archaeological conservation, the reason that so much care and expense are devoted to stabilising objects that might seem to have little practical value. We save these things not because we have exhausted their meaning, but precisely because we have not, because the knowledge they contain exceeds what any single generation of researchers can extract. The cannons and anchors, the pewter and lead shot, the medical instruments and personal effects, all of it constitutes a repository of potential knowledge that will continue to yield insights as long as human curiosity persists. The waters off North Carolina's coast hold their secrets loosely now, the most famous of their wrecks no longer hidden but catalogued and studied and integrated into the public heritage of the state and nation. Other wrecks remain unknown, their locations lost, their artefacts waiting in sediment that may never be disturbed. Somewhere beneath those shifting sands lie vessels whose stories we cannot yet tell, whose crews left traces that may or may not survive to be discovered. The sea keeps what it takes with an indifference that mocks human schemes of preservation and memory, yielding its dead only when chance and circumstance align to permit discovery. Queen Anne's Revenge was found because conditions favoured its finding, because the right people looked in the right places at the right times with the right methods. Other ships remain hidden because conditions have not yet favoured their emergence, or perhaps never will. The fragmentary nature of the archaeological record reminds us that what we know represents only a sample of what existed, our understanding of the past constrained by the accidents of preservation and discovery that determine what evidence survives to be studied. Yet what has survived from Queen Anne's Revenge suffices to transform understanding in ways both scholarly and popular. The pirate ship that once terrorised the Caribbean has become a vehicle for education, its artefacts teaching lessons about maritime history, colonial economics, the slave trade, material culture, and the human capacity for violence and solidarity. The research continues, the conservation proceeds, the educational programs expand to reach new audiences, and somewhere in the protected waters of Beaufort Inlet, the remaining fragments of the vessel rest in sediment that has settled back over excavated areas, waiting for whatever future investigations may be undertaken. The ship lies quiet now, as it has lain for over 3 centuries. The thunderous broadsides that once announced its presence have long since echoed into silence. The black flags that once flew from its mast have rotted to nothing. The men who sailed aboard it have been dead for nearly 300 years, their bones scattered or dissolved or buried in unmarked graves across the Atlantic world. All that remains is the wreck itself, and even that is a remnant, a fraction of what the vessel once was, its timbers dissolved, its rigging vanished, its form suggested only by the distribution of more durable materials across the seafloor. Yet from this remnant, from these scattered artefacts, from the patient work of archaeologists and conservators and historians, something has been recovered that transcends the physical objects themselves. We have recovered contact with human experience, connection across the centuries with people who live differently than we do, but who shared with us the fundamental conditions of mortality and desire. The pirates of Queen Anne's Revenge sought wealth and freedom and perhaps something less easily named, some escape from the constraints that organised their world into hierarchies they had not chosen and could not accept. That they pursued these goals through violence and theft does not separate them entirely from our common humanity, however much it complicates any celebration of their memory. They were people, not legends, and the evidence recovered from their vessel restores to them something of the particularity that legend always obscures. In the end, the wreck speaks in a language older than words, the language of material evidence that persists after voices have fallen silent and memories have faded. The objects wait in their cases, stabilised against further decay, available to whoever comes to study them. The records accumulate in archives, digital and physical, documenting every phase of recovery and analysis. The knowledge grows, branching and deepening as new researchers bring new questions to familiar evidence, and the inlet maintains its vigil over whatever remains, its currents still moving, its sands still shifting, its waters still holding traces of all that has passed through them over centuries beyond counting. The story of Queen Anne's revenge has no final chapter, because the study continues, because new discoveries remain possible, because the collection will outlast all of us who live to wonder at it today. But if there is a moral to be drawn from this long history, from the slave ship's transformation into pirate vessel, from the pirate vessel's grounding on shoals it should have cleared, from the centuries of forgetting followed by accidental discovery and patient excavation, it is perhaps this: that nothing is ever entirely lost, that the past persists in fragments waiting to be reassembled, that human curiosity and human care can recover what human violence and human negligence have scattered. The dead cannot speak, but they have left behind objects that testify to their existence, and in studying these objects we extend to them a recognition they could not have expected to receive from a world so distant from their own. The seas that Blackbeard sailed still roll under the same sun, their surface glittering in patterns that have played across these waters since before any human eye existed to observe them. Beneath that surface, in the darkness of the deep, the wreck maintains its long communion with the sediment and the currents, and the countless organisms that have made their homes among its timbers and ballast. What was lost has been found, what was forgotten has been remembered, and what seemed at first to be merely a collection of corroded artefacts has proven to be a window into a world we can never directly enter, but can, through evidence and imagination, begin to know.